Hey, Tony Jones here for thehardestquestion.org. Uh, Russell Rathbun. Russell, good one this week about Second Timothy, and here's the deal. The funny thing is, I can't imagine hardly any pastor who is going to preach the lectionary text from Second Timothy this week when they could be preaching, a parable which lends itself to such great homiletical flourishes. But regardless of how good Russell's post was on the gospel lesson, I am really intrigued by this question about Second Timothy, and there are a couple different things about it that I think are so intriguing and lead me to a hardest question, which is a similar hardest question to a hardest question that I've had oftentimes before. But first, this question about what does this really tell us about Paul? And as Russell writes, it's beautiful and sad. This letter from Paul, and he's honest in it. He even does things that I think we would struggle to commend to preachers these days, and that is he calls out his enemies. Um, Russell writes in there, he lists 26 different names that Paul writes about in this short book of Second Timothy. But Paul calls people out, even in the text for this week. He calls out people who've, only Luke is with me, and, go get Mark and bring him to me, for he's useful in the ministry, and don't forget to grab the cloak that I forgot at dinner the other night, and bring it also with books and parchment. And then he calls out Alexander the coppersmith and says he did great harm to my ministry and he opposes our message. And Paul is just brutally honest throughout this whole passage and throughout this whole book. And it's funny, I think the hardest question is, one of the hardest questions is, would we ever preach this? Would we ever call out our enemies? I mean, I know that conservatives, probably many of whom do not ever visit thehardestquestion.org, are known to sometimes call out their enemies from the pulpit. But how come we just don't ever see, we don't see liberals, progressive preachers calling people out? I mean, maybe they call out Donald Rumsfeld from the pulpit, but I don't think you're going to get much pushback on that. But do they ever call back the last year's moderator of the church council who did great damage to our message or something like that? I think if we put ourselves in the place of Paul, maybe was he just having a bad day? Was he down as he was writing Second Timothy because he'd had kind of a rough go of it? Anyways, that's a really intriguing homiletical angle to take, to even ask a congregation, how comfortable would we be if our preachers did the same thing that Paul does here? He's honest, he's sad, he's as Russell writes, he even seems a little scared and lonely. But as has been the case before, my biggest, hardest question is actually not about that, but it's about why the people who put together the Revised Common Lectionary left out verses 9 through 15. How do you, when you're putting together a lectionary for preachers to use to guide us through the lectionary year, how do you take passages that Paul wrote and were meant to flow from A to Z, and you cut out J through M because you don't think it's preachable? Because it's not because the people who constructed the lectionary wanted shorter passages for public reading, because as we found out last week in Russell's post, the entire Psalm 119, the longest chapter in the Bible, is included in its entirety. So that's commended for public reading. But here we've got Second Timothy, the lectionaryers, as Russell calls them, decide to expurgate verses 9 through 15, which is about these very things, like bring me my cloak, and Alexander the coppersmith is a bad dude, stay away from him. And it's actually the pragmatics of everyday mundane ministry issues that Paul had in his ministry. And I think it's intriguing. I find it really interesting. I think it humanizes Paul, and I think it's preachable. And the hardest question for me is, why in the world is it not in the lectionary?